Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I am Rebecca Beardsall and I'm thrilled to have you here with me today. This is a space where I am going to talk about books that I'm reading, to not only talk about the ways that the book was written, but the way that the story is told, and also any other insights or patterns or things I see in there. The goal of this is to become a community where we can discover and talk about books together. This is something I talk about with people that I coach in their writing careers is that writing and books and stories, they're all in conversation with other books, stories, and writers and readers. It's not a single thing. It's part of a community. And so I am opening up this space to start branching out in a new way, not only with the people that follow me, but hopefully gaining some new followers to build a bigger community to talk about books and to investigate how books reflect our lives back to us or give us insights that we weren't expecting. So today we are going to be looking at Tom Comitta's The Nature Book. I am super excited to dive into this book today. And one of the main reasons is that as a writer and also as somebody who studies writing, I love when authors push against form. It's something I've done in my own memoirs. I coach other people. I teach workshops on this and I just love it. It's fascinating to me. And so when my friend recommended this book to me and kind of told me what the book was about and like how it came together, I was like, oh, that sounds fascinating. I want to read it. And so for those of you who don't know about the Nature Book, it is a novel, but it is a novel without a single word written by the author. And you might be wondering how that is. Well, it is because Comitta used the nature portions of 300 other novels. So they are using the language, the sentences, oftentimes the sentence structure of other authors. So it really is this beautiful layering effect of how stories can come together. In this way, the book itself shows what I've been talking about, how writers are in conversation with other writers, whether they know it or not. And as readers, we join into those conversations. And I think they talk about how this is seen as like a collage, a way of collaging together the narratives. And you think about the way a collage layers and, brings things together that might not always go together. So like some juxtaposition there as well. And also in collage, there's like a meditative state of that as well. And Comitta mentioned that this isn't just a novel or a story. It is in some way an archive, which I also love. Thinking about a way of preserving the language of others, the sentences of others, the spaces that might have also been ignored. And I think this is really fascinating in this way that you think about when you're reading. I just had this conversation with another reader. When you're reading and you get to those long parts of the novel where page and a half, 2 pages, that you're just getting a description of what the day is like or what the garden looks like. These are often the spaces that we skim over, that we quickly read through because we want to get to the story. We want to get to like what's happening. Where are the characters? What's going on? I want to know. And so I think they also recognize in the collaging and the archiving that these are the spaces that most readers tend to skim over. It is the nature pieces. It is talking about what the sun was like that day or what the wind felt like and again, we're like more like who killed who or are they going to get together or not or what's going to happen with that? Like you're like, I don't care what the sun's doing. So I really appreciate that. That's really, what they ended up doing and bringing into this space. So for me, I have the physical copy of the book and I also have the audio book. And I started reading this, physical book, and it felt a lot like that space of I'm reading the parts of books that I don't often like or that I skim over. So it felt a little cumbersome. So I listen to books when I walk. It's like my motivation to get out there and walk. And I usually do it at a higher speed so that I'm walking faster. And anyway, I was out walking one day and my book ended. And so I was like, oh, I need to pick another book. And the next one on my list was the nature book. So I was like, oh, perfect. And I started at the beginning, even though I had already read some of the book myself ahead of time. But what surprised me was that I walk on an urban trail in Washington State. And so I am in the woods essentially the whole time I'm walking. Yes, there's housing and roads and stuff near me, but you don't know it, right? And so I'm listening to the story unfold and talking about what's happening in the season. So the book itself is has different sections, and in those sections they have numbered chapters. And so the first section is the four seasons, and then we have the deep blue sea is the second, the void is the third, and the endless summer is the fourth. So on my first walk listening to this, it was the four seasons, and so it kind of moves you through those spaces of a season. And as I was walking, I'm feeling the sun on my face. I'm feeling the breeze and hearing the breeze through the trees. I'm watching rabbits, eating on the side of the trail. I'm listening to birds. I hear squirrels having an argument. I see does with their fawns, eating on the side of the trail. And I was like, whoa, this book is like watching this. And, as I walked over the bridge and I looked down and I saw the sun, dappling on the water and see the trout like moving through the water. And it was like, it was incredible to think about how this novel gives you that space where it's like walking in the woods. It's like, or being at the sea, or, climbing the mountain. You are just in the space experiencing what's happening. That really altered my way of reading this, is that it's hard going into a novel and thinking, I want to know what's going to happen. What's the storyline? And basically moving through what's just happening in the world. And so yeah, that really altered my reading, and I just kind of fell in love with it then. I was like, this is beautiful in the way that it's like what I'm seeing is what I'm listening to. So it was lovely. And I think what's interesting about this is that it shifts like all these moments in nature and what's happening, and it pulls it all together into making that something is happening. So I talked earlier about when, when the nature scenes are part of a novel is often what gets overlooked because people just want to get to the story. So when you're like, well, if there's no story, if you're not following characters, what are you doing? And this just turned it around and said that this is the story. What is happening? There's a story all around you. You might not recognize it because we think about ourselves and our relationships and what's all going into that space. But that same like cycle is happening right in front of you. And you often don't think about it as its own story. Yeah, beautiful. So it was interesting to me that we get animals in there that are like we are part of part of the story. Like as I was walking, they were talking about beavers and otters, and then later like wolves, and just kind of like what was happening there. But in that, um, it's important to note that they don't use that literary space of making the animals like human, right? Anthropomorphize them, right? Like it is just animals being animals. They don't start talking. They don't have a narrative. They're existing. And yes, they are a part of a story. Um, but it's not the same. And so I was getting to a part in the first section, the first 4 seasons, where it's going into wind. And being a fixed air sign, I thought it would be so great to kind of investigate the way that wind is used in this space. And so it kind of started a little bit around 20, but really in 22 is where it kind of got into this space. And so this is in the 4 season section. And so it's talking about, so I'm going to just give some quotes here. It's like, throughout the springtime, the wind did not blow very hard, but in a warm, sweet gust. Down here was a softer note in the sound of the wind. Now, if the wind blew a branch, a flower, it was solely for their good, that they might increase in strength and happiness. Like this is the movement, right? Like of how it's like the sweet spring wind, right? Like it's there, it's doing things, it stops, it continues. And I just was like, oh, it's just beautiful. Because again, as I'm walking and feeling all of that, the other interesting thing about this novel is that there are a lot of like deja vu moments where you're like, I've been here before, I've heard this before, I know this. And that is because these are words of other authors. And it was so interesting to me that stories that I've read before, like why I would connect that, why I would remember that. So I guess I didn't skim over them too much because they're still with me in some way that I was like, oh, that seems very familiar. I couldn't like pinpoint what novel that was, but that seemed really familiar. Um, so anyway, we continue on in this. And then when I moved into the second section of the book, and that's the deep blue sea, we get a lot of the ocean, a lot of, what's happening, the birds and everything going on there. But interestingly enough, we get back into the 20s of that section and we're back at the wind. And so I was like, ooh, is this what's happening here? Do we, every time we get into the 20s of the section, that the wind then becomes essentially the character? Like this is the driving force, as we get into the 20, 21, 22 section. But kind of. So in this one, we have that the wind shifted, the clap of empty thunder settled to the soft, continuous rumble, which was almost drowned by the sound of the rain. And so we're at an island in this space where like we get the wind in here. The wind might have by this time lulled a little, but the wetness spread with a pervasive determination. Um, and in this way, it moves into the wind and the waves. And at the end of this section, there's a quote that says, here we go. Then the world began to change. Miraculously, out of the heavens, in 4 great waves, nature spoke. And using that like nature spoke is again reminding us of what this is, what we're reading. This is the story of nature. And so in this way, nature spoke. And the last sentence in this chapter says, soon the sun leapt up over the rim of the world. Nature smiled once more. Again, putting nature as the character in this space. So I was fascinated to see, like, so section 3 was smaller, that's the void. And then section 4 was longer and had a 20, 20, 22, 20, 24 in that area. And so I was like, oh, are we going to get the wind? Are we going to get the wind? And so 22 of the fourth section, this is in the desert. No, we did not get wind. Instead, we got a gray mule and a burro. And so we're getting this description at the start of this of the desert and what's going on in that space. And then it says, then one day, these two animals who had been voyaging across the desert for many weeks appeared in the distance, trotting easily. And it continues on, and it introduced to us that it is a mule and a burro, and they're just kind of moving along. And then they continue to come back throughout the rest of it. There are moments where they reappear. And so you're like, in some way, you're like, okay, we're following them through now the rest of the book, which I thought was interesting because a lot of the other sections, we would have the section of the beaver and then it would be over. And then we have the section of the wolves and then we wouldn't hear about wolves again. But in this section, the mule kept coming back. The burro, interestingly enough, did not, but the mule did, which made me wonder a little bit. Pulling up where I have another note here. Oh yeah, so that was chapter 22 where they were introduced, the mule and the burro, but then they came back in chapter 25. And then they continued on, and eventually it was just the mule. So as I was wrapping up the book, I, was fully immersed in this space. Nature is the story. Some of this I was listening to as I was walking out in nature and experiencing nature. Some of it I was reading. And today I was listening to it, and it was the last, I think it's close to the end, chapter 27 in the fourth section. And this sentence. So apart from the steady heat and the nearby rock forms and the plants, memories of this night are extremely hazy. And I was like, wait, what? Whose memories? It felt to me a little outside of what I was experiencing. And I get that we might be thinking, okay, this is nature's memories. This is the animals' memories, but we haven't been experiencing the animals like that we are in their heads. Instead, we just see them doing things. So I was a little taken off by that. Like, what does that mean, and why did they put that there? Because in the afterword of the novel, there's a deep description of the process that they went through to build this novel, and very particular about what sections they used and what they didn't. And even to the point, like when they started it, they didn't want to use any kind of human like terms or notions that people would think about, and like the bank of a river, right, felt like bank, wasn't a financial institution. But then they realized that, well, it's hard to talk about a river if you're not talking about the bank of the river. So, okay, we're going to put some of those things in there because that is actually describing what it is, even if like our minds think about banks as a financial institution. So I thought, when I was listening to the afterword and then again reading it, I was like, why do we have the memories of this night are extremely hazy? At first, again, it was like, oh, so nice. Yes, the memories. And then I was like, wait, whose memories? What does that mean? So I don't know. I think that's where I kind of pulled out of the space of seeing this as, following nature and just observing what was going on. And it started to transform into our interaction with that, whether it's my memories of the night there are extremely hazy? Is there a person there? Is it the author? Is it the authors? All the people that have been writing it? Um, so anyway, that was my one space. I think there was another one later on that had a similar um, way of kind of pulling the reader out of it, of what we were looking at as nature in that space. But fascinating too, listening to it, because there's some spaces where, you know, the words are sometimes sounds like, you know, like those kind of sounds. And so just to hear somebody rattle off, you know, a whole bunch of like, you know, like churning and plop, you know, churning and churning and IE mo push, right? Like really, really interesting. And that whole section with all those sounds was supposed to remind us of the crashing waves, the sound of the ocean. And so putting together a whole bunch of sounds, which I would love to know in that section, what got pulled from what novels, to kind of go into this space of waves crashing and what that sounds like. Um, like, yeah, like here's another one. Sure, shoot, God, brash, God, rush, sure, shaw, shoe. Right? So again, giving that like sound of the ocean, but using words. And so in some way, these aren't nature words, but they are words that were part of the other novels that this author put together to create or recreate in the reading the sound of the ocean. So that's another way of blending the other stories and the other parts of nature, and the other work of the authors to come together into this space. So overall, it was an interesting process and an interesting read. I think for me, again, I always want to kind of look at the way that authors are pushing against that standard way of writing and using form in different ways. And to think about writing as a conversation and joining in on a conversation, and then like literally producing a book that is the conversation and building along others. I think the other note in the afterword about the process of all of this, they talked about how they tried to stay true to punctuation and the fragments and the different spellings between the US and the UK. And um, so reading it then again, like mashes together some of these things, but there are some places where a few adjustments were made, but on a whole, um, the author tried their best to leave the spaces and the sentences of the other authors intact, and written as they were, but really looked at this layering and bringing together and pulling the pieces into conversation to build out the experience of nature. So I'm curious if you've read this book, what your experience was with it. I still think it's so interesting to me that it's a common thing that readers do to read over the nature parts of stories, of novels. And so then to think about what that means to pull in the spaces that may have not been fully read or absorbed by all these 300 novels, and put them on a showcase as this other novel to say, you may not have read it here, but here it is in this space for you to come and read and experience it. But also, what they talked about in the afterword is that often when authors are using and putting nature into their stories, there's a reason. Like they're trying to set mood, they're trying to help you understand what's going on, or they use it as foreshadowing or things to kind of think differently about what's coming up because of the storm that's happening, or, or the sun's come out after such a horrible experience, right? And so in some way it's mood. It's also like ways to put metaphor in there, but to then totally pull that out and just put those sentences into this space, um, totally adjust the way that it was even used by the first author. So yes, I'm going to end there. I think again, I probably said fascinating and interesting and so many times today, but uh, I just love the way that they decided to come in conversation with other authors, and to the point that they didn't add their own voice, but allowed the others to speak, but in their way of pulling it together and in their way of collaging it together to build a story. There is an arc, there is a movement. You are going through, in each section, you're going through a movement. And so you can feel that it is a story, but it doesn't develop as a story as you would think it does. Thank you for joining me today. I am so happy you are here. I look forward to sharing more with you. Have a blessed day.